The truth unveiled on a fateful flight. The lead flight attendant's voice rang out sharply, loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "I'm going to ask you one last time, move to the back of the plane or I will call security." Her words were razor-sharp, dripping with condescension. Her eyes held an air of authority, as if she was in complete control of the situation. Sitting before her was a composed black woman who slowly looked up. Ava Sinclair remained unshaken, her eyes exuding quiet strength. "I've already told you, I'm not moving." Her voice was steady, almost soothing, yet it carried an undeniable firmness. Passengers fell silent, their gazes shifting toward the unfolding confrontation. The air in the cabin grew tense. Ava was being humiliated in front of everyone, but no one expected what was about to happen next, when the woman they assumed to be powerless stood up and revealed a truth that would leave them speechless. The sleek private jet gleamed under the afternoon sun, its silver exterior reflecting the golden light like a jewel on the runway. Everything about this aircraft spoke of luxury, plush leather seats, gold-trimmed accents, and an atmosphere of exclusivity reserved for society's elite. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers moved with ease, pulling their designer luggage behind them. Some settled into their seats, scrolling through their phones, while others sipped on fine champagne served by the attentive flight crew. Soft ambient music played in the background, adding to the elegant atmosphere. Among them sat Ava Sinclair, a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a tailored navy blazer paired with matching slacks. She didn't need flashy jewelry or ostentatious accessories to stand out. The way she carried herself, calm, self-assured, made it clear that she was someone important, even if no one on board knew it yet. Ava stepped into the cabin, her composed presence drawing subtle glances. Her movements were graceful but deliberate, her eyes briefly scanning the space before heading to her seat. For her, this wasn't just another flight, it was a journey to oversee her ever-expanding empire. But for now, she preferred to keep her identity a secret. At the entrance, Madison Harper, the lead flight attendant, stood with an air of authority. Every inch of her uniform was crisp and perfectly tailored, her posture rigid, her expression sharp. Madison took pride in maintaining order on the plane, though her version of order often depended on how people looked and behaved. She greeted passengers one by one, her warm smile reserved for some and noticeably absent for others. And when her eyes landed on Ava, that smile disappeared entirely. "Welcome aboard," Madison said coolly, her voice polite but devoid of warmth. Behind Ava, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, stepped onto the plane. Mrs. Reynolds clutched a small knitting bag, her fingers twitching to begin her craft, while Mr. Reynolds folded his newspaper neatly, taking in his surroundings with a quiet air of familiarity. The moment Madison saw them, her demeanor shifted. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds. It's wonderful to have you with us again." Ava glanced over her shoulder, noting the stark difference in tone. Though her expression remained neutral, her eyes reflected an understanding of the unspoken dynamics at play. The first-class cabin of this flight had unwritten rules. And Madison Harper, with her calculated smiles and scrutinizing gaze, was the one enforcing them. But what she didn't realize was that today, those rules were about to be shattered. Lightbulb, the story continues. How could Ava Sinclair, dismissed and looked down upon the moment she stepped onto the plane, completely shift the power dynamic with nothing but her calm presence? Keep reading to find out. Rocket. Madison's heels clicked softly against the plush carpet as she moved through the cabin, her sharp eyes scanning each row, each passenger. She prided herself on maintaining order, though her version of order was dictated more by appearances than actual protocol. As she passed Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, her entire demeanor shifted. Her smile widened, her voice softened. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds. It's always a pleasure to have you with us." The warmth in her tone was unmistakable, a practiced hospitality reserved for those she deemed deserving of it. Seated just a few feet away, Ava noticed the shift instantly. She had already observed how Madison's gaze lingered on certain passengers with admiration, while others, like herself, received nothing more than a cold acknowledgement. But she didn't react. She didn't need to. Instead, she remained composed, silently taking in the unspoken rules Madison was so accustomed to enforcing. Around the cabin, passengers continued settling in, adjusting their seats, placing their designer carry-ons in the overhead compartments, sipping champagne. The atmosphere was light, almost celebratory as conversations hummed in the background. Madison, ever the perfectionist, moved with trained efficiency, ensuring every detail was in place. She stopped at the Reynolds row again, her expression glowing with professional courtesy. "Is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" she asked, her voice brimming with warmth. Mrs. Reynolds, already absorbed in her knitting, shook her head politely. Mr. Reynolds simply gestured toward his coffee in quiet satisfaction. And then Madison moved again, her polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the carpet, until she reached Ava's row. In an instant her warmth vanished. Her gaze flicked toward Ava's neatly placed carry-on, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't offer the same polite check-in, nor did she extend the same courtesy she had just shown moments ago. Instead, she simply walked past without a word. Ava didn't move. She didn't shift uncomfortably or demand attention. She just observed. Because, as much as Madison wanted to pretend otherwise, Ava already knew what was happening. And soon, Madison would realize she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Madison scoffed, dismissing Ava's words with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said, her tone dripping with impatience, but something in Ava's gaze made her uneasy. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued or pleaded. She simply sat there, poised and resolute. Passengers continued to whisper among themselves, their eyes darting between the two women. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others watched with open curiosity. Grace, the junior flight attendant, stood frozen, her fingers twitching as she glanced toward the passenger list near the cockpit. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in her eyes. Ava noticed. Still calm, she spoke again, her voice quieter but carrying undeniable weight. "This is your last chance to do the right thing." Madison let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "The right thing?" she sneered. "The right thing is making sure people sit where they belong." Her voice had risen, drawing even more attention. The nosy socialite, now fully invested in the spectacle, leaned in closer, eyes glinting with excitement. The businessman across the aisle, who had been silent until now, exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Maybe you should listen to her," he finally said, his voice level but firm. Madison shot him a glare but ignored his comment. Instead, she turned her attention back to Ava, taking a step closer. "I won't ask again," she warned, her patience wearing thin. "Move now, or I'll have you physically removed from this plane." Ava met her gaze steadily. Then, in a move so subtle yet deliberate, she reached for her phone. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the screen, sending off a message before placing the device back on the armrest. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Madison's face. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder. Passengers who had initially ignored the situation now sat upright, watching with renewed interest. Some exchanged knowing glances as if sensing something far bigger was at play. Grace shifted uncomfortably. Her grip on the passenger list tightened as she hesitated, the conflict evident on her face. And then, without warning, the cockpit door opened. A uniformed figure stepped out, his expression unreadable as he scanned the cabin. The pilot. The room fell silent. Madison straightened, her confidence momentarily shaken. This wasn't part of the plan. She turned toward him, schooling her face into one of controlled authority. "Captain," she said smoothly, forcing a smile. "Everything is under control, just a small misunderstanding." The pilot didn't respond right away. His eyes landed on Ava, then flicked back to Madison. Then, with a voice far calmer than the storm brewing beneath it, he said, "We have a problem." And just like that, the power in the room shifted. Madison folded her arms, her smirk growing as she turned toward the passengers, as if seeking validation. "We have rules for a reason," she declared, her voice carrying through the cabin. "And some people just don't respect them." A ripple of murmurs spread among the onlookers. Some nodded in passive agreement, others exchanged uncertain glances. Ava remained unfazed. She didn't react to the insult, didn't flinch at the blatant attempt to turn the crowd against her. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, her steady gaze never leaving Madison's. The effect was immediate. The longer Ava remained calm, the more Madison's composure began to crack. Passengers were no longer just watching out of curiosity, they were judging. Sensing the shift, Grace took a small step forward, clearing her throat. "Maybe we should just check." Madison snapped her head toward her, eyes blazing. "I said I have this under control." Grace's lips pressed together and she took a step back, hands clenching at her sides. Ava exhaled slowly. Then, with a quiet precision, she reached for her phone again. This time she didn't type. She simply picked it up, glanced at the screen, then placed it back down. Madison's eyes flickered toward the device, a flicker of unease betraying her confidence. Ava leaned forward just slightly, her voice as soft as it was powerful. "I warned you." A beat of silence. Then movement at the front of the plane. The cabin door opened. All eyes turned as a uniformed figure emerged from the cockpit. The captain. Madison's posture stiffened. The smugness drained from her expression, replaced by something much less certain. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as the captain strode toward them, his face unreadable. He stopped beside Ava's row, his gaze sweeping from her to Madison. Then, in a calm, authoritative voice, he spoke. "Miss Sinclair, I apologize for the delay. Is everything all right?" A pin could have dropped in the silence that followed. Madison blinked. Her throat bobbed. She turned to the captain, attempting to recover. "Captain, I was just handling a seating issue." "Is that right?" The captain's tone remained neutral, but his eyes held an unmistakable edge because I just received word from management that the owner of this aircraft is on board. Several gasps broke out among the passengers. The nosy socialite clutched her seat, her mouth slightly agape. The businessman let out a low, knowing chuckle. Madison went rigid. Her breath hitched. The captain turned toward Ava, inclining his head respectfully. "Miss Sinclair, do you require any further assistance?" Ava allowed a small, measured pause before she spoke. "No, Captain. But I do believe we need to discuss your lead flight attendant's conduct." The weight of her words settled like a thunderclap. Madison's face drained of color. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and now she knew it. Madison's grip on the tray tightened as she moved down the aisle, her jaw clenched in frustration. The murmur of passengers behind her still lingered, a reminder that she had lost control of the situation, something she was not accustomed to. She placed the tray down at the service station with more force than necessary, causing a soft rattle of glasses. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her uniform, forcing herself to regain composure. But the uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. She stole a glance toward Ava, who remained composed, her fingers lightly resting on her armrest. Even now, she didn't look triumphant or smug, just unbothered, as if Madison's tantrum had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. That infuriated her even more. She should have moved. She should have backed down. But she hadn't. And now, Madison could feel the weight of the passenger's judgment pressing down on her. Across the aisle, the businessman who had previously spoken in Ava's defense leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes flicking toward Madison with disapproval. Nearby, the nosy socialite, who had been entertained moments ago, now pursed her lips, her earlier amusement replaced by a hint of unease. For the first time, Madison felt something foreign creeping into her chest. Doubt. Had she really miscalculated? Her fingers twitched as she turned back toward the galley, forcing herself to focus on something, anything, else. But before she could take another step, the cabin intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Madison froze. The passengers quieted instantly. "We've just been informed of a situation that requires our immediate attention. As a result, we will be making an unscheduled landing shortly. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin for descent." A wave of whispers spread through the cabin. Madison's stomach dropped. She turned sharply toward the cockpit, her pulse quickening. This couldn't be happening. Not over something as small as a seating dispute. But then her gaze fell on Ava, who simply adjusted her blazer, her face calm, completely unsurprised by the announcement. And that was when the pieces started falling into place. Madison's breath hitched. This wasn't just about a seat. She had severely underestimated the woman sitting before her. And now it was too late to undo what she had done. Madison's breath was uneven, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her own fury. She couldn't believe the audacity of this woman, this nobody, who refused to cower like she was supposed to. The anger in her veins pulsed hotter with every second. Her control, the one thing she prided herself on, was slipping. And then, before she could stop herself, her hand lashed out. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin. Passengers gasped in shock. Ava's head barely moved from the impact. Her skin stung where Madison's palm had struck, but her posture remained perfectly composed. For a moment, everything was silent. Madison stood frozen, her hands still hovering in the air, the realization of what she had just done hitting her like a tidal wave. The businessman across the aisle bolted upright. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Grace clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Other passengers whispered in hushed, disbelieving tones. Ava slowly turned her head to face Madison, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down Madison's spine, she said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The weight of those words settled over Madison like a crushing force. She staggered back, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The whispers around her grew louder. Passengers pulled out their phones, some discreetly, others openly, recording everything. Ava remained still, her gaze locked onto Madison's, unshaken. Then a deep voice shattered the moment. "Miss Sinclair, is everything all right?" The captain stood at the front of the cabin, his expression deadly serious. Madison's stomach plummeted. Her world, her entire sense of authority, was about to crumble. Madison let out a short, derisive laugh, though there was a crack in her confidence that hadn't been there before. "Call the police?" she scoffed, trying to regain her footing. "For what? Enforcing the rules?" But her voice lacked the same sharpness it once had. The energy in the cabin had shifted, and even she could feel it. Ava said nothing. She simply held Madison's gaze, her silence more powerful than any retort. Then, in a quiet but deliberate motion, she reached for her phone once again. Passengers watched, their eyes darting between the two women. Some had already been recording, their screens reflecting the drama that had unfolded before them. And then, the unmistakable chime of an incoming message filled the air. Ava glanced down at her screen. Her expression didn't change, but something in the way she exhaled sent a ripple of unease through Madison. "She knows something." Before Madison could react, the captain reappeared at the front of the cabin. His expression was unreadable, but the authority in his stance was unmistakable. The murmurs died instantly. Madison swallowed hard. "Miss Sinclair," the captain addressed Ava directly, his voice even. "Would you be willing to step aside for a private word?" Madison's heart pounded. What is happening? Ava didn't move right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering. Then, with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the ordeal, she stood. The cabin remained eerily silent as Ava adjusted her blazer and, without a glance toward Madison, walked toward the front of the plane. The moment she passed the captain, he turned his gaze on Madison. "Miss Harper, I need you to come with me as well." Madison's stomach dropped. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes widening. The businessman folded his arms, watching with unmasked interest. The nosy socialite whispered hurriedly to her companion. Grace, still standing near the galley, exhaled shakily, but her eyes flickered with something close to relief. Madison forced a tight smile. "Of course," she said stiffly. "I'd be happy to clear up this misunderstanding." But deep down she knew. This was no misunderstanding. And whatever was coming next, she wasn't ready for it. Ava's words hung in the air, a quiet declaration that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Madison's smirk faltered just for a second. The weight in Ava's voice, it was too certain, too measured. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had remained silent were now leaning in, watching with quiet anticipation. Something was happening. And then, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We ask that all passengers remain seated as we address an urgent matter." Madison's body went rigid. Ava remained still, her expression unreadable. The businessman across the aisle exhaled sharply, his suspicions confirmed. The nosy socialite clutched her pearls, eyes widening in shock. Grace, who had returned to her post moments earlier, gripped the edge of the service counter, her knuckles white. She had made the call. And now, it was too late for Madison to undo what had been set in motion. A few rows away, a sudden movement caught everyone's attention. The cockpit door swung open. A uniformed officer stepped into the cabin, followed closely by the captain. Madison inhaled sharply, her pulse hammering against her ribs. This wasn't happening. But it was. The officer's eyes swept the cabin before locking onto Ava. His expression shifted immediately, his posture straightening as he addressed her with unmistakable respect. "Miss Sinclair, are you all right?" The silence that followed was deafening. The title, Miss Sinclair, was like a lightning strike through the room. Madison's face drained of color. Passengers gasped, their hushed murmurs turning into a wave of realization. The businessman let out a low, knowing chuckle. The nosy socialite's jaw dropped open. Even Grace, who had suspected something, had to steady herself at the confirmation. Madison's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This woman, the one she had humiliated, dismissed, slapped, wasn't just any passenger. She was Ava Sinclair. And she owned the plane. Madison's throat felt dry. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago now felt like a flimsy shield, cracking under the weight of the passenger's stares. Ava hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't retaliated. And that terrified her. The businessman across the aisle still hadn't moved, his eyes locked onto Madison with unwavering judgment. The nosy socialite, who had once been entertained, now looked thoroughly uncomfortable. Even Grace, timid, hesitant Grace, had stopped avoiding eye contact. Instead, her gaze flickered between Ava and Madison with an expression that looked dangerously close to pity. Madison's stomach twisted. This was wrong. This was all wrong. She had expected Ava to crumble, to plead, to shrink under the weight of authority like so many others before her. But Ava had done none of that. Instead, she had let Madison fall into her own trap. And now she realized there was no way out. A soft chime sounded overhead, another announcement. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, firm and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated as we approach an unscheduled landing. Cabin crew prepare for arrival. Madison's breath hitched. An unscheduled landing? This wasn't happening. She turned, desperate to find some sort of escape, some explanation. But all she found were watchful eyes, passengers waiting for her downfall. Ava let out a slow breath, then adjusted her cufflinks. Finally she stood. She didn't need to say anything. Because the damage was already done. Madison's frown deepened, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Step aside, she repeated, incredulous. Why? I've done nothing wrong. The pilot's expression didn't waver. His gaze was steely, unwavering, a stark contrast to the unease creeping into Madison's stance. Passengers held their breath, their eyes darting between the two. Ava remained silent, watching. Waiting. The captain exhaled, his patience thinning. Miss Harper, he said, voice measured. This is not a request. Something inside Madison lurched. This was real. This was happening. She glanced toward Grace, toward the businessman, toward the nosy socialite whose intrigue had morphed into outright shock. No one was on her side. The realization hit like a cold wave. Madison's jaw tightened, but she stepped back. The captain nodded, then turned to Ava, his demeanor shifting instantly. Miss Sinclair, he said, his tone respectful. We sincerely apologize for any mistreatment you've experienced today. If there's anything you need. Madison's stomach dropped. The murmurs from the passengers turned into hushed exclamations. There it was. The confirmation. The truth that Madison had ignored, dismissed, underestimated. Ava Sinclair wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner of the plane. Madison's breathing hitched. The businessman exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as if he had expected this all along. The nosy socialite let out a stunned whisper. Even Grace looked as though she had to steady herself against the weight of what had just been revealed. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. Ava didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. She simply turned to Madison, her gaze unwavering. And with the quiet authority that had unraveled Madison's entire world, she said, Actions have consequences, Miss Harper. And you're about to find out just how true that is. Madison's breath hitched as she watched the two assistants stride purposefully into the cabin, their presence commanding attention. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The businessman straightened in his seat, his expression unreadable. The nosy socialite clutched her pearls, still reeling from the revelation. Grace stood near the galley, hands clasped tightly together, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ava remained serene, her presence unshaken despite the whirlwind unfolding around her. One of the assistants, a tall woman in a perfectly tailored suit, stopped just beside Ava's seat and inclined her head respectfully. Miss Sinclair, everything has been arranged as per your instructions. Madison's stomach clenched. Ava finally stood, her movements graceful yet deliberate. She smoothed her blazer, then turned to the captain. Thank you for your professionalism, she said evenly. I trust my team will handle the rest. The weight of her words settled over the cabin like a final verdict. Madison opened her mouth, to protest, to explain, to salvage the last shreds of her authority, but nothing came out. She looked around frantically, searching for support. But the passengers weren't on her side. The businessman merely shook his head. The nosy socialite, sensing an opportunity for gossip, pulled out her phone and started recording. And Grace Grace met her gaze, her expression unreadable. For the first time Madison realized she was alone. The lead assistant turned toward the captain. "We'll need a private space to debrief with Miss Sinclair before she departs," she said smoothly. The captain nodded. Then his gaze shifted to Madison. "And as for Miss Harper," he said, his voice firm, "she will be escorted off the aircraft immediately." A sharp gasp rippled through the passengers. Madison's body went rigid. "Wait, what?" she stammered, her voice unsteady. But the assistants were already moving. The second assistant, a man with an air of quiet authority, stepped forward. "Miss Harper, if you'll come with us." Madison took a step back, her entire world tilting beneath her feet. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. But it was. Her hands clenched at her sides, her pulse roaring in her ears. Then she made the mistake of looking at Ava. Ava wasn't gloating. She wasn't smirking. She was simply watching. And that, somehow, was worse. Because this wasn't revenge. This was justice. And Madison Harper was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Madison's breathing was uneven, her pulse hammering in her ears as she desperately searched the cabin for support. But there was none. The passengers who had once ignored the situation now watched with rapt attention, their expressions ranging from shock to quiet satisfaction. The businessman sat back, arms crossed, his gaze steady and unyielding. The nosy socialite clutched her phone, recording every second. Grace stood motionless near the galley, her lips parted slightly, as if struggling to process everything unfolding before her. And then there was Ava. Poised, unshaken, entirely in control. Madison's chest tightened. This was real. This was happening. She tried again, her voice wavering. "Miss Sinclair, I didn't mean." Ava didn't blink. "You didn't mean to get caught," she corrected coolly. The words landed with a sharp finality. Madison flinched. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a tide of agreement swelling against her. The lead assistant turned to the captain. "Arrangements have been made. Ms. Harper will be escorted off the aircraft immediately." A cold dread settled in Madison's stomach. She shook her head, stepping back instinctively. "Wait, please." But no one was listening. A uniformed officer appeared at the entrance of the cabin, his stance firm. The realization crashed into Madison like a wave. This wasn't just about her job. This was humiliation. This was accountability. This was the end. Her fingers trembled at her sides, her breath uneven as she cast one final glance toward Ava. But Ava had already turned away, her focus shifting back to her assistant, the matter of Madison Harper already dismissed. And that, Madison realized, was the greatest punishment of all. Madison staggered backward, her mind racing, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This couldn't be happening. But the cold professionalism in the officer's face told her otherwise. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the passengers leaned forward, watching with rapt attention. The nosy socialite gripped her phone, now openly recording, her lips parted in shock. The businessman simply shook his head, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Grace remained still, her hands clasped in front of her, but there was no trace of sympathy in her face anymore. She had seen enough. One of the officers reached for his cuffs. "Miss Harper, please turn around." Madison's breath hitched. "No, wait," she cried, her voice cracking. She turned to Ava, her eyes pleading. "Miss Sinclair, please." I lost my temper, but I didn't mean." Ava tilted her head slightly, considering her. Then in that same quiet, devastating tone she said, "You made a choice." The weight of those words crushed whatever argument Madison had left. Her shoulders slumped. The officer moved behind her, his hands firm but not rough as he secured the cuffs around her wrists. A wave of gasps rippled through the plane. Madison squeezed her eyes shut, her face burning with humiliation. As the officers led her toward the exit, the cabin remained eerily silent. No one spoke. No one defended her. And just before she disappeared through the cabin doors, Madison chanced one last glance over her shoulder. Ava wasn't watching her anymore. She had already moved on. And that, somehow, was the most devastating punishment of all. Ava walked toward the exit, her every step measured and deliberate, the sharp contrast between the chaos Madison had created and the order she had restored evident in the quiet hum of the cabin. Passengers sat still, absorbing the gravity of what had just unfolded. Some exchanged hushed whispers, while others simply stared, as if trying to reconcile the woman they had seen mistreated moments ago with the powerful presence now leaving the aircraft. The businessman let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in admiration. "Now that," he murmured under his breath, Was justice served right? Ava didn't react. She didn't need to. She paused at the threshold, the evening air from the open cabin door brushing against her skin. Turning slightly, she glanced at Grace, the young flight attendant who had, despite her fear, shown a flicker of integrity when it mattered most. "I meant what I said," Ava told her, her voice softer now. "Expect a call soon?" Grace nodded quickly, still a little stunned, but her posture straighter, her expression brighter. With that, Ava descended the stairs. Outside, her sleek black SUV waited, her assistants already positioned by the open door. She barely noticed the flashing lights of news cameras beyond the terminal fence, the world already catching wind of what had transpired. Her phone vibrated in her palm, a new message. She read it once, then twice. Her lips curled into a knowing, satisfied smile. This wasn't just about one flight. This was about setting a new precedent. And as she stepped into the waiting car, the hum of the aircraft behind her fading into the distance, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. As the plane ascended into the sky, Ava leaned back in her seat, letting out a slow, measured breath. This flight felt different, lighter, freer, as if the very air carried a sense of renewal. The warmth in the crew's demeanor was evident, not forced but genuine. Every interaction, every courteous gesture, reaffirmed what she had always believed: respect should never be conditional. She glanced toward the lead flight attendant who had just finished checking on a nearby passenger. Catching Ava's gaze, the woman smiled warmly. "If there's anything you need, Miss Sinclair, please don't hesitate to ask." Ava nodded in appreciation. "Thank you." The sincerity in those words, both spoken and unspoken, made all the difference. She turned toward the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance below. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. She had walked onto that previous flight as a passenger, quietly observing, assessing. She had walked off it as a force of change. And now she wasn't just flying to her next destination. She was soaring toward something greater. The response was immediate. Social media erupted with discussions, praise, and personal stories from people who had experienced similar injustices. Hashtags like #RespectForAll and #FlyWithDignity began trending, with thousands of people sharing their thoughts on Ava's stance. Some applauded her leadership, while others reflected on their own encounters with bias and unfair treatment. Passengers from past flights even chimed in, recounting experiences, both positive and negative, that underscored the urgent need for systemic change in the airline industry. News outlets ran with the story, analyzing the broader implications of Ava's statement. Some lauded her decisive action, while others debated whether this would push other airlines to follow suit. Would this set a new standard for customer treatment in luxury travel? Ava scrolled through the flood of responses, her expression thoughtful. She hadn't done this for publicity. She had done this because it was time. Still, seeing the shift, the way the conversation was evolving, the way people were demanding accountability, filled her with a quiet sense of satisfaction. A soft knock at her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant stepped inside, a tablet in hand. "You should see this," they said, offering it to her. Ava took the device and glanced at the screen. An email from a major competitor's CEO sat at the top of her inbox. Subject: "Let's talk about change." She exhaled slowly, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. This wasn't just about one flight, one mistake, or one lesson learned. This was the start of something bigger. And she was ready to lead the way. For days, the conversation refused to fade. People from all walks of life applauded Ava Sinclair's leadership, praising her grace under pressure and her commitment to changing an industry that too often turned a blind eye to bias. Hashtags like #RespectAboveAll and #AvasVision trended across platforms, sparking debates and personal reflections. Some people shared their own experiences of prejudice in travel and beyond, while others questioned their own biases, realizing how easily assumptions could shape interactions. Ava hadn't set out to go viral. She had set out to set a precedent. And now it was happening. The ripple effect extended beyond her airline. Corporate executives, flight crews, customer service professionals, and everyday people took notice. Policies began to shift. Airlines reevaluated their training programs. A new conversation had begun, one that couldn't be ignored. Ava watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. Because this wasn't just about one flight, one mistake, or one person's downfall. This was about building something better. And she had only just begun. Life lessons from The Truth Unveiled on a Fateful Flight. The story of Ava Sinclair is more than just an unfortunate incident on a flight. It is a powerful lesson on authority, justice, and accountability. Light bulb lesson 1. Never judge people based on appearances. Madison Harper took one look at Ava and jumped to the wrong conclusion. She assumed Ava did not belong in luxury simply because she did not fit the image Madison expected. But in the end, it was Madison who did not belong in her role, as her prejudice and lack of professionalism led to her downfall. Light bulb lesson 2. Strength lies in composure and dignity. Ava did not raise her voice, did not retaliate, she remained calm and let the truth reveal itself. Her unwavering confidence made Madison unravel. When faced with injustice, we don't have to react the way others expect. We can use intelligence and self-assurance to reclaim our power. Light bulb lesson 3. True power comes from how you treat others. Ava did not use her status to threaten or seek revenge. She simply allowed Madison to face the consequences of her actions. In life, power is not just about wealth or titles, it is about leading by example and treating others with respect. Small blue diamond, have you ever been treated unfairly because of someone's false assumptions about you? Small blue diamond, how would you respond if you were in Ava's position? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel Soul Deep Stories for more meaningful narratives about justice, courage, and change. Backhand index pointing right, let's spread these valuable lessons together. Blue heart sparkles.